Now, Christopher, let's start with one I think that is a very important one to talk about, especially as we get a focus on Tasmania. It's one of the jurisdictions that you're looking out for in your role as an ACL State Director. Some danger of conversion laws. They've been confirmed with a bit of fact-checking. What's happened?
So, back 2 or 3 weeks ago, Neil, we supported a forum run by, I think it's called Free Speech Australia in the Tasmanian Parliament. And Dr. Diana Kenny, one of Australia's leading psychologists, spoke, along with a mum whose child has had a very bad experience with the whole issue of transition, and a parent's advocate, and some others. We then put out a Facebook post identifying what happened at that forum, what was said, and we said something like this, that the laws proposed by the Tasmanian Law Reform Institute would mean that urging caution on a child would be a breach of the law. Now, the AAP did a purported fact check on that particular claim, and they published something last week saying that that was false. They spoke to one of the co-authors of the Tasmanian Law Reform Institute report and another self-identified legal expert, Dr. Wayne Morgan, and they said that claim was wrong. But in so doing, they exposed what we've always said about these recommendations, that parents are in the gun, fairly and squarely. And Dr. Gogarty, one of the co-authors, said, and I quote, "The report makes clear that the law does not currently and should not in the future provide absolute protection for parents." Dr. Morgan said the TLRI, quite rightly in my opinion, decided not to recommend limiting the entire scope of what would become unlawful conversion practices so as to always exclude any action by a parent. Now, the questions that exposure by the author of the report, no less, poses for the Tasmanian government is, where's the line? Because they're talking about conversations around the kitchen table. And, for example, Dr. Gogarty said that if you treat a child like they have a mental disorder when they don't, so he's making this claim that a child doesn't have a mental disorder, that would be probably made illegal by the report. So the question that this exposes, which is what we've been saying for a long time, and people have been denying it, the advocates of this legislation and saying nothing to see here, is where do you draw the line? You're sitting around your kitchen table. How many times can you talk to your child about an issue? What can you say? What can't you say? And the government now has to come clean. Either they're going to say parents are out of it or parents are in it. This is the challenge for the Premier, who has been advocating this, and others. We stand by what we said. The claim, we reject the fact check, but the fact check has exposed the issue. And it's now up to the government to tell Tasmanian parents that they're not going to be in this legislation. Or if they plan to do that, they've got to state, because they're invading the kitchen table.
So the question here, Christopher, as I can hear and every listener can hear you exposing quite significantly, is can parents be parents responsible for their children, or will they be criminalised when they seek help for their child and in their parental view think there might be some necessary support needed for their child? So you've got this choice, being a parent or being a criminal. This criminalising of parents really makes us very, very uncomfortable.
That's the question. Now, this fact check quoted from an introduction of the report which said, supportive care, guidance or mentoring of a child by a parent which are conducted in the best interest of the child are not affected. Well, great. I mean, the state is saying you can care for your children. But what they didn't say, Neil, was that at page 10 of the report, they say supporting care, guidance or mentoring of a child by a parent or guardian which are conducted in the best interest of the child are not conversion practices unless they involve the direct or indirect conduct set out above. So what they say is, you're not caught by the proposed legislation unless you are. And that's what this so-called fact check has exposed. The co-author of the report has said, at some point, parents are in the gun. So what we're saying, and we put out a media release, and we're calling on the government now to be honest. Tell the Tasmanian people, where's the line? If parents are in the gun, if you're coming into the kitchen table, if you're coming into the lounge room of Tasmanian parents, you tell us where's the line.
So you've got politicians and you've got activists pushing for this law reform for Tasmania. And in some sense here, what you're saying is this report and what the legal insight is saying is that people are being lied to by those politicians and activists who are pushing for it.
Well, whether they're lied to or not, I don't know. But what we're saying is you tell us the truth. It's now clear that parents are in the gun at some point. Everyone's agreed on that now. We've been saying this for a long time. The activists have been saying nothing to see here. It's now clear. Parents are in the gun. You tell us, government, you tell us where that line is. You tell us how much I can say across the kitchen table to my 15-year-old. You tell us.
This is the thing, isn't it? We don't want any interference in what, as a parent, you might pass on as a good value to your teenager. But this is already the law in Victoria, Christopher, and WA's announced last week that they're looking to introduce conversion laws too. Is there something that's coming from Victoria that's influencing all of this legislation, or because it's in place in Victoria, do people in Tasmania think we better just follow the Victorians? What are your thoughts here?
I think Victoria has led the way down the slippery slope, and it's not a slippery slope. We're at the bottom of the cliff, really, with this legislation in Victoria. Tasmania seeks to go a step further, and it's the Tasmanian model proposed by the Tasmanian Law Reform Institute is worse than the Victorian model, if that's possible, but it is. So, but there is a pushback. Just recently, an association called the Gender Exploratory Therapy Association has produced very good guidelines of how to treat gender-confused kids. And they say they don't approach it on any preconceived notion. They say, let's explore. And what they do find is many of these kids have comorbidities. They have issues that have to be dealt with. That's the way England's gone expressly down this route. They've rejected affirmation therapy. We are 5 years behind. And if we follow this route, we will hurt kids. That is the heart of our opposition to this legislation. We will hurt vulnerable kids. The Tasmanian government will hurt vulnerable kids, and it's just not good enough.
So, Christopher, for Tasmanians listening into our conversation today, they've heard you say the Tasmanian model is worse than the even Victorian model. What sort of action can a Tasmanian listener today take so far as letting their voice be known?
Well, we would encourage every Tasmanian listener to contact the Premier and say to him, we do not want these recommendations. If you want to ban coercive practices or misleading practices, go your hardest. But don't come into the kitchen table. Don't stop our kids being properly cared for. Tell that to the Premier. Tell that to the Attorney General. Tell that to your local MP. This is the life of kids, and we have to stand up. And then, and I make this serious call to every Tasmanian church. Firstly, pray. Pray publicly every Lord's Day. Lead your church pastors in prayer against this. Neil, in the Psalms, there are what I call imprecatory prayers, where the psalmist cries out against wickedness. And we have to do that. And secondly, preach. Preach the truth. This is the time for the pulpits of Tasmania to stand up and say, we must not do this.
Interesting, isn't it? When we talk about prayer in church, different churches do things in a different way. Some churches will have a extemporaneous prayer. Others will have a written prayer. In a circumstance like this, and you say, well, I'm going to take this to my pastor and we're going to pray about this on Sunday. In front of the whole church. It wouldn't be an unwise thing, would it, Christopher, to write down a prayer that perhaps if the pastor prays it, well, the pastor, has responsibility for what is spoken from the platform or prayed in that church, but perhaps write down a prayer, get the wording right. You might even be helpful there, Christopher, if someone wants some wording for a prayer to use in church, because some people might be thinking, "Oh, that's a little bit, it's a little bit challenging to get a prayer together." But yes, writing down the prayer. What are your thoughts around that?
Sure. So if people want some specific words, they just have to send us an email to tasoffice@acl.org.au, and we'll provide them. But the issue is that the state doesn't interfere with parents talking to their children. The state doesn't interfere with proper therapeutic care for children and for adults who need help. This is statism really going off the rails, where the state wants to take control. And we have to say no.
There might be something new here that you've broached that might well catch on in churches around the place everywhere, Christopher. The thought that you might write down a prayer and pray that in church. And there's so many issues, so hard to get your head around everything that's happening in your own state, let alone throughout the states and territories around the nation, that somehow or other, some guidance for the sort of prayer that might be prayed in churches that a pastor can sign off on. It doesn't matter who says that prayer, but to lead a congregation, that might be something for the future.